Thank you for joining us today. I'm Linda Zavala, and I've been a devotee of Meher Baba for about 21 years. And I'm really happy to have you tuning in for our interview today. And today we have a very special guest, Don Stevens, who has been a follower of Meher Baba as well for many years. And he's a retired businessman right now, and he's living in the south of France. He's come to the United States to give some workshops on one of Baba's very important written works called God Speaks. And I'm very happy to introduce you to him today. He's written, I think, about 5 books, and he's also co-edited 2 books of Meher Baba. And so, Don, I'd like to ask you, could you tell us briefly who Meher Baba is and how one could relate to his teachings?
Well, first, who Meher Baba is, I suppose I would be tempted to say I think he's the most important person in creation. In any case, he was born into a Parsi family in Pune, India, went through the normal sort of schooling that children in India went through. When he got to be about 19 years old and was actually going to what they call the Deccan College there, he'd be bicycling home in the evening, going by a park where there was a very ancient Sufi saint, Hazrat Babajan, and around her would be usually accumulated some of the soldiers that were going home from the local encampment. So Meher Baba stopped and he would listen on the edge, and one day this elderly saint beckoned to him and he came near and she kissed him on the forehead, and that was the beginning of a very, very important series of events. He practically lost complete consciousness at that point, and gradually made his way to a majority of the great saints, we call them perfect masters of India in that day, and one of them turned him over to his chief assistant, Upasni Maharaj, who also, in the jargon of the trade, was a perfect master as well, and he took Meher Baba under his wing and gradually brought him back down to normal consciousness after a considerable period of time. So this is Meher Baba, and he lived most of his life in India, doing a great deal of traveling. First of all, picking up with his old school friends who adored him, and began, let's say, a spiritual discipline with them. And gradually his work extended into other areas, into Europe and into America, and he made very many trips all through the world. To the Far East as well.
And he was situated in India and traveled around?
Yes.
And his ashram is in India?
Well, if you would call it an ashram, let's say it was very simple living and no particular buildings dedicated to special purposes. But at any rate, where he lived originally at a place called Meherabad, very near Ahmednagar, not too far from because has been and still is a great technical center in India. He lived there, and then on the opposite side of Ahmednagar in another charming place called Meherazad. And so it was in this area that he spent most of his time when he was not traveling, and people would come to him there on various different occasions. He would make quite extensive trips, and perhaps the most famous of those was when he was looking for what are called musts, M-A-S-T-S, and these are, I think, the nicest shorthand way of describing a must is to say that it is an individual who is intoxicated of God. which means to you and me, they appeared just plain crazy. But to Baba, he recognized the fact that they had had a very deep spiritual experience which had fixed their attention on God. So their recognition of the world about them was at a minimum or almost non-existent.
And could you tell us a little bit about how you first came to Meher Baba, how you heard about him?
Well, that was sort of a long story. And
how many years have you been with him? Or
Well, let me put it this way. I became devoted to a person who became one of his chief disciples. She was the head of the Sufi order in her day. She had been the first initiate of a very great Indian musician and mystic by the name of Hazrat Inayat Khan, his first initiate. And when Hazrat Inayat Khan died, this first initiate, whose name was Rabia Martin, then began to search for what would be the successor to Inayat Khan to carry her along the spiritual path. And eventually came across two quite wonderful and deeply steeped in the lore of Meher Baba ladies who lived in New York. She spent some time with them, about 2 years, as much time as she could spare. She lived in San Francisco, so it was a good way away. And after 2 years of doing her utmost to feel into this individual who attracted her greatly from the first, she came to the conclusion, first of all, that he was her successor as spiritual guide and master to Inayat Khan. And I remember she used the term almost immediately that he was the great spiritual master of the age. You know, not just for a few weeks or even a few years, but for the age, which was very impressive. So she gave us, and this was quite a dramatic incident, she gave us 2 weeks to decide whether we would follow her under the spiritual guidance of Meher Baba. I might add it posed a tremendous crisis to me because I'd never heard of the man before. And to try to make such an important decision in that period of time, it wasn't easy. So I finally had to make an appointment. I tell you about it because it meant so much to me, and I think it's a beautiful little story. I called her on the telephone and said, I've just got to sit down and talk about a few important things. So we sat down and I said, well, now, first of all, his silence bothers me because he's a terribly important and busy man. So why does he keep silent? And she listened to this and nodded her head and waited for my next thing. And I wanted to know, what about all of this business of being the avatar of the age? How can I judge that? And how can you judge it if you've never even seen the man? I didn't put it quite that baldly, but that was the general intent. And she listened to this and one or two other little bag of tricks that I had to trot out before her. And at the end of it, she said just a very simple thing, and that is, Don, how can the drop measure the ocean?
Very significant.
Well, when she asked me this, I knew immediately she was dead right. So I went home and thought about it, and my conclusion simply was that if she, the one person of all whom I revered and trusted totally and completely, if she had accepted this man as her guide and had made such an important statement that she had about his spiritual status, then what more could I do? So I said, I follow you.
Wonderful. Well, we are here today to talk about God Speaks, this wonderful book of Baba's. And you and Murshida Deuce were asked by Meher Baba to edit the manuscript. And if you could tell us a little bit about that, when that was and how that came about, that would be good.
Well, I'll go back just a little bit into the earlier history that preceded God Speaks itself. One of the closest schoolmates in his early school days of Meher Baba had been an individual who was trained largely in Muslim mysticism in the Sufi school. And he was a very, very brilliant person. Meher Baba loved him very much. And he stayed very close to MeherBaba from the time that MeherBaba, as it were, integrated back into the conscious world around him. So Dr. Ghani, as he was called, he was trained as a doctor, stayed with Baba, and very often did various different writing things for MeherBaba. On the occasion that we're talking about now, the beginnings of the book, which became God Speaks, MeherBaba would give him various key points from time to time, which he wanted Dr. Ghani to take and then elaborate and then write out a book, which Baba said had to be given out to humanity, which would be a very important spiritual book. The only trouble was that in 1951, when Dr. Ghani, I don't think he was more than 50 some odd at the point, had a heart attack, died, and this was very upsetting to MeherBaba. He said, but I had so many things I wanted Ghani to do, and now he isn't here. So he immediately had one of the close ones in the place where they all lived together at Meherazad, go looking at Dr. Ghani's belongings to get out the manuscript. So the manuscript was brought over, and some of it was read out to Baba, and Baba looked rather nonplussed and bewildered, and he said, but this is very nice material, very good, but it isn't what I was giving Dr. Ghani to write into the book. So at that point, Baba decided that he was going to have to take the matter in hand, and for a period of several months, it was a very, very tedious process. He would give, again, key points to perhaps his chief male disciple, Arish Jesawala, wonderful individual, and Arish would jot down these key notes, take them to his bedroom, and write them up into more detailed and logically coherent paragraphs. First thing the next morning, he would take this back to MeherBaba, read it out to him, and on 2 occasions, MeherBaba had Arish describe to me the exact manner in which they proceeded, because apparently he felt it was extremely important. As soon as Arish would read out something which was problematical or mistaken, Baba would clap his hands and Arish would stop. And then Baba would, with his sign language, discuss with Arish what the problem was. Usually it was fairly simple, but Baba wanted me to know that if it was a word that was extremely important and which in some manner or another had to be lit upon, decided upon very accurately, he would have Arish go to the length of repeat the alphabet quickly, A, B, C, D, E, F, and write it the proper letter. He would stop Arish. And in this fashion, a really very, very important word would be spelled in this very laborious fashion. So this was the manner in which Baba gave out the large bulk of God Speaks. And the second part of God Speaks, which is called the supplement, is the material which Dr. Ghani had written up with a great deal of Sufi material. When he gave the manuscript to Murshid Adus and to me for editing, he said, well, Ivy, that was her first name, you can either accept and include the Ghani material, you can discard it all, or you can pick out certain portions that seem of particular interest to you and include those. You make the decision. So Murshid Adus, when I got to New York on this occasion, when she had just received the manuscript, I think Baba gave us 6 or 7 weeks to do all of the editing that had to be done.
Very short amount of time.
Well, it seemed impossible, to be quite frank. So, but at any rate, we had to set our nose to the grindstone. And she said, well, Don, I'm very much attracted to the material that Ghani wrote, and it seems to me perhaps that will take a bit more complicated concentration, so perhaps I had best handle that, and you take the material that Baba dictated, gave direct to Arish Jesawala. So I set off on my field trip and huffing and puffing around in trains and so on in the east of the United States, while she worked in New York City. And we did have, incidentally, and I think it's a matter of some importance, several very important to us, key questions, either material that was ambiguous that we couldn't understand, or which was just frankly beyond our depths. So we would fire off a quick message to get to Baba quickly in India, and he would immediately respond, sometimes with 2 or 3 or 4 pages. And always what he sent back impressed us as being so enormously important that we decided, well, we have to keep this and use it in the first edition of God Speaks. So sometimes it became a starred footnote if it were in the material that he had dictated to Erich. If it were extremely interesting, but not necessarily related to the direct dictated material, then we would include it somewhere in the supplement, but always in quotation marks, and usually with a statement, Baba replied or Baba elaborated, something of this sort. But it is also some of the finest material in the book.
Well, I know you've been involved with God Speaks and also translations for a number of years. And I'm wondering what you think for someone who's interested in following the spiritual life, why they would want to read this book and what they would find interesting about it.
Well, why they should be interested in reading it. Of course, I'm prejudiced because I feel, as Murshid and Martin did, that Meher Baba is the great spiritual figure, the great giver of the spiritual message of this age. So Baba always said that this was his last, final, and really important work. And in fact, when we were discussing a little bit later after its appearance, Baba's words in general, he made a statement that struck me as being of extraordinary interest. I said, well, Baba, nowadays there's so many people, even people, for instance, who love you dearly, who say that matters of illumination, truth, and so on, simply cannot be understood by the intellect. And words, after all, are secondary, and the real thing is what was inspired through the heart. So I said, well, Baba, I'm not sure how much even your words are going to be used despite all of the work. So he looked terribly shocked and said to me, well, Don, I must make it clear to you that when Baba gives out his words to the public, he attaches something like an atomic bomb of spiritual energy. So each of the words has this energy associated with it, and an individual who works with my words inevitably will absorb a part of that spiritual energy, which will be extremely important in their ongoing spiritual development. And he said a strange thing at that point, and I thought it was a rather odd statement to make, but I've seen people experiment with it. He said, in fact, even in reading through Baba's words, even if the individual does not understand intellectually the content, in other words, it's just like reading a little nursery rhyme or something of the sort, even if they do not understand the content that I have put in it, still, this spiritual energy they will absorb. So that simply says that an individual should give the patience, the time, the energy, and the concentration to really do work with it.
And he does speak about creation and evolution and involution.
This is the story of creation.
And he goes into great detail about it.
Very great detail. In fact, there is even a good bit of repetitive detail, and this can be very putting off to people who are trained in the tradition that one should never repeat something in a well-written work. But he has his own reasons in back of this. In fact, I think I perhaps wrote something in the preface to the book that was a bit beyond my understanding at the time, but I think the words were, were properly chosen, perhaps by Baba himself. I said, God speaks is like a Bach prelude and a fugue, and this is the fugue, in which a simple theme is selected, and then it's repeated, and the simple theme is elaborated a little bit. It's still repetition, and then it's elaborated more, and then there are 2 voices, and then 3 voices, and they interweave. And this is very much the mechanics which Baba uses in that, and through it all, he elaborates from the original viewpoint that he adopts of creation and the experiences of the gradual evolution of consciousness and then the perfecting of consciousness. Baba gradually changes from the viewpoint of the drop soul, the you and I, our viewpoint. We're caught up, after all, and hypnotized by all this panorama that's going on around us, and that's the important thing. And then he gradually shifts through to the viewpoint of God, who is going through this experience for the development of his own consciousness. So when I said that God speaks is the story, or it is the description of the creation of creation, all of that is simply to satisfy the potential whim of original unconscious God to know his divinity consciously. So all of this great saga of creation with all of its complexity is for the development of consciousness so that God may be conscious of his own divinity.
And there's an incredible amount of detail in each chapter. And the book kind of seems to go from the stone state all the way to being absolutely perfect and one with God again.
Oh, I'm glad you bring that up. If you have a moment, I'd like to tell you about my dilemma. When not very long ago, I was reading through for perhaps the 100th time this gradual progression from what he calls the sub-gaseous state through the gaseous to the stone, to the metal, to the vegetable. And when I was looking at the description of going from the stone, the metal state, to the vegetable state, I noted, as I had in the past, that the vegetable state form is really constructed on the habit patterns and experiences of the last metal state. And so the idea that a carrot, for instance, could be based upon, a drop of quicksilver or maybe a little vein of iron somewhere in nature, it just seemed like a tremendous jump. And then, I'm not a psychic person at all, but once in a while, especially if it happens to be early in the morning hours, if for some reason I've awakened and have to go here or there, as one does on occasion, all of a sudden there will be an insight into something or another. So I've been puttering over with this great problem: how under the sun can you jump from metal experiences? It's ductile and it carries electricity, but it's not very sophisticated. And here you've got a carrot or a cauliflower or whatever vegetable you want. And that then is a tremendous jump. So there was this funny little voice in the background in my own nature which said, Don, even though you were trained as a chemist in the university, you've probably forgotten by now that magnesium is the central atom and molecule of chlorophyll, which is the center of the metabolic and living processes of the carrot. So I thought, good heavenly days, this is absolutely fantastic. And so I went on puttering on towards my bedroom, and then all of a sudden a little voice says, even a little bit more quietly, and you've probably forgotten also that iron is the center of the hemoglobin molecule. And that just really tickled me to pieces. I thought, that's the bridge over. Now, I don't pretend that that's the whole, the complete knitting together of the difference between a metal form and a vegetable form, but it provided a key bridge, and it made the process seem more possible.
We have just a few minutes more, but it seems that the way Meher Baba has written this book, there's his clarity and detail on the various points is really wonderful. And there's a lot of joy even in the book.
Well, I think you have to have a certain amount of persistency to get to that point. But then when it starts to blossom, it blossoms magnificently.
Okay. And there's been a lot of interest in God Speaks recently around the world.
Well, I would say this, that a great deal of the effort that we put in for some years now into translations is coming to fruit. And I would just have to say to you, for instance, that we have in Spain, certainly everyone feels, the finest esoteric publisher of Spain. And he said that he and his father, who founded the business, feel that there has been nothing written like this book for 3,000 years. And because the editor, the publisher in France, who occupies a comparable position there, had told us only 2-3 weeks before almost the same thing. He said, since the Vedas, the Upanishads, nothing has been written of this caliber. So that excites me.
Well, thank you so much for being with us. It's wonderful you could come to America again and visit. Thank you.